In 1942, the Soviet military strapped a pair of wings onto a tank, towed it behind a bomber, and told a test pilot to fly it into a war zone. That same decade, the United States handed infantry soldiers a portable nuclear weapon with a blast radius larger than its own firing range. And New Zealand built an entire tank using nothing but a farm tractor and an American postcard. Every single one of these vehicles got approved, funded, and built by actual governments with actual defense budgets. At least you'd think someone in the room would have raised a hand and said something. Nobody did. These are the 10 most idiotic military vehicles ever built by man. And somehow they only get worse from here. But this list doesn't start with the craziest ones. It starts with a simple question. What happens when engineers run out of good ideas but governments keep writing checks? You get vehicles that look like rejected props from a science fiction movie. You get weapons that threaten their own operators. And you get designs so absurd that even the people who built them couldn't explain why they did it with a straight face. Every vehicle on this list was real. Some were prototypes, some were tested in the field, and a few were actually mass-produced and handed to soldiers who had to use them. Let's start with number 10. Number 10. The Hiller VZ-1 Pawnee. Picture this. It's the 1950s. The Cold War is heating up, and the United States military is convinced that the future of warfare involves individual flying soldiers, not helicopters, not jetpacks, a platform you stand on while two large rotors spin directly underneath your feet. The Hiller VZ-1 Pawnee was exactly that, a one-man flying platform about the size of a large manhole cover, powered by ducted fans beneath the pilot's boots. The soldier stood upright on top of it and steered by shifting their body weight. Lean forward to go forward. Lean left to go left. One bad stumble and you're feeding yourself into spinning rotor blades. The Army tested it at Hiller Aircraft's facility in California, and the results were about as useful as you'd expect. The VZ-1 topped out at around 16 miles per hour and hovered at roughly 10 feet off the ground. At that height and speed, you're not a tactical asset. You're a very slow, very loud target, standing completely in the open with zero cover and zero armor. Any soldier with a rifle could take you out without breaking a sweat. The program was scrapped after the Army realized the obvious. A man hovering slowly across a battlefield is just a more expensive way to get shot. The VZ-1 was basically a human drone before drones existed, except drones don't care about getting hit. But a flying disc is one thing. What happens when an entire country looks at a bicycle wheel and thinks, yeah, that could be a tank? The Tsar tank. World War I. Trench warfare has turned the battlefields of Europe into a muddy, barbed wire nightmare. Every military power is desperate to build something that can cross trenches and break the stalemate. Britain eventually came up with the actual tank. Russia came up with a giant tricycle. The Tsar tank, also called the Lebedenko tank, was a massive vehicle with two front wheels that stood nearly 27 feet tall. That's roughly the height of a 3-story building. A single rear wheel, about 5 feet tall, was supposed to handle the steering. Each front wheel had its own engine. The whole thing looked like someone had built a medieval siege tower on top of 2 wagon wheels from a fever dream. The story of how it got approved is almost better than the vehicle itself. Engineer Nikolai Lebedenko built a small working model powered by a wind-up motor. He brought it to Tsar Nicholas II and demonstrated it scooting across the palace floor. The Tsar reportedly watched this little toy roll around his office, was charmed by it, and approved funding for a full-scale prototype on the spot. A head of state greenlit a military weapon because the toy version looked fun. The full-size Tsar tank was completed and brought to a testing field outside Moscow. On its very first outing, the tiny rear steering wheel sank straight into the soft ground and got hopelessly stuck. The massive front wheels couldn't generate enough torque to pull it free. A vehicle specifically designed to cross trenches in rough terrain couldn't even handle a muddy field. It sat abandoned in a Russian forest for years, slowly rusting until it was finally scrapped for parts in 1923. Locals occasionally stumbled across this enormous metal skeleton in the trees, which must have been a confusing hike, which, looking back, was either incredibly bold engineering or incredibly stupid engineering. Probably both. Now, a tricycle tank is ridiculous, but at least it was made of steel and wood. The next vehicle on this list was supposed to be made of ice. Number 8. HMS Habakkuk. The Battle of the Atlantic is raging. German U-boats are sinking Allied cargo ships at a devastating rate, and Britain desperately needs more aircraft carriers to provide air cover across the open ocean. The problem is, they don't have enough steel to build conventional warships fast enough. Enter Geoffrey Pike, an eccentric British inventor who proposed one of the wildest ideas in naval history. Build an aircraft carrier out of pykrete, a frozen mixture of water and wood pulp. Pykrete is surprisingly tough. A block of it can stop a bullet, and Pike argued the ship would be essentially unsinkable because, well, ice floats. If the hull got damaged by a torpedo, you just spray seawater on the hole and let it refreeze. The planned dimensions were staggering. HMS Habakkuk would have been 2,000 feet long, making it roughly twice the length of the Titanic. It would have weighed 2.2 million tons, with hull walls 40 feet thick and a massive refrigeration system running through the entire structure to keep it frozen. Winston Churchill loved the concept. He reportedly sent a memo to his military chiefs that read with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for cricket scores, urging immediate investigation of the pykrete ship. A small 60-foot prototype was actually built on Patricia Lake in the Canadian Rockies. The thing took an entire summer to fully melt after the project was abandoned. Engineers eventually ran the numbers and realized the refrigeration plant alone would require roughly 8,000 tons of steel. The whole point of the project was to save steel, and they need thousands of tons of it just to keep the ice from melting. At that cost, you could simply build a regular aircraft carrier. And no, I'm not making that up. They genuinely tried to fight the German Navy with an iceberg, and the British Prime Minister was on board with it. HMS Habakkuk never left the drawing board. But this next vehicle, the U.S. Army put it into full production, and every soldier who drove it wanted to throw it into the ocean. Number 7. The M561 Gamma Goat. The Gamma Goat was a 6-wheeled amphibious cargo truck with an articulated body built for the U.S. Army starting in the mid-1960s. On paper, it could carry troops and supplies through jungle terrain, ford rivers, and handle rough conditions across Southeast Asia and Europe. On paper. In reality, every soldier assigned to a Gamma Goat despised it with a passion that bordered on spiritual. The driver and engine compartments constantly filled with a vile mixture of water, oil, and mud, even when the vehicle hadn't been anywhere near a river or stream. The electrical systems shorted out on a regular basis because of all the moisture pooling in the chassis. Starting one on a cold morning was an act of prayer. The vehicle was technically classified as amphibious, meaning it was supposed to swim across bodies of water. It barely floated. Soldiers who attempted river crossings reported that the Gamma Goat leaked like it was actively trying to drown itself. It used its spinning wheels for propulsion in water, which was wildly inefficient and barely moved the vehicle forward. The articulated 2-section body, which was supposed to give it flexibility on rough ground, instead caused it to jackknife on turns, break apart at the joint under stress, and throw passengers in the rear section around like laundry in a dryer. Troops had several nicknames for it. The printable one was simply the Goat. The unprintable ones were far more creative. The real kicker? The Army kept it in service for nearly 20 years, from 1966 to 1986, because they'd already purchased too many to justify replacing them. The classic military procurement trap: too expensive to scrap, too terrible to use. The Gamma Goat couldn't handle water, but this next vehicle couldn't handle something even simpler: landing. Number 6. The Convair XFY Pogo. The early 1950s. The U.S. Navy wanted fighter jets that could operate from small ships without runways. Their solution was a plane that sat on its tail like a rocket, blasted straight up into the sky, flew its combat mission horizontally, and then came back and landed vertically, tail first, on a tiny platform. The Convair XFY Pogo was a turboprop-powered fighter with delta wings and a massive propeller on its nose. Takeoff was the easy part. The plane would sit vertically, engines roaring, and lift straight up off the ground. It actually looked impressive. Landing was the nightmare. To set the Pogo back down, the pilot had to transition from horizontal flight into a vertical hover, then slowly descend tail first while looking backward over their shoulder at the ground. Picture parallel parking a car while hanging upside down from the seatbelt and staring through the rear window. Now make the car a jet engine balanced on a column of thrust. Test pilot James Coleman, known as Skeets, actually flew the Pogo successfully multiple times at Naval Air Station Moffett Field in California. The man had nerves made of something stronger than steel, but even Coleman admitted that the transition from horizontal flight to vertical hover was one of the most dangerous maneuvers he had ever attempted in his career. The fatal flaw wasn't the technology, it was the scenario. Even if a pilot could stick the landing on a calm sunny day on a concrete pad in California, imagine attempting it on the pitching deck of a Navy destroyer in rough seas, at night, in combat conditions. With people shooting at you, the Navy canceled the program, but the Pogo did prove that vertical takeoff and landing was possible, which eventually led to the Harrier jump jet decades later. So something good came out of asking a human being to land a fighter plane backward. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover insane military history and engineering disasters every week. Alright, so here's where things get truly absurd. Because while the Americans were trying to make planes land on their tails, Nazi Germany was building a tank so heavy it broke the concept of ground warfare. Number 5. The Panzer VIII Moz. By 1944, Nazi Germany was losing the war on every front. Resources were vanishing. Fuel was desperately short. The rational military strategy would have been to build smaller, cheaper, more efficient weapons. Instead, Ferdinand Porsche, yes, the same Porsche family behind the sports car company, designed the heaviest fully enclosed armored vehicle ever constructed. The Panzer VIII Moz weighed 188 metric tons. For perspective, a modern American M1 Abrams battle tank weighs about 62 tons. The Moz was 3 Abrams stacked on top of each other in sheer weight. It carried a 128mm main gun and a 75mm secondary gun, wrapped in armor plating up to 240mm thick. On paper, nothing on the battlefield could penetrate it. The problem started the moment it tried to move. Top speed on a paved road was roughly 13 miles per hour. Off-road, it crawled at barely walking pace. It had a massive Daimler-Benz engine and still couldn't move itself at a reasonable speed because it weighed as much as a small apartment building. Then there was the bridge problem. The Moz was too heavy for any bridge in Europe, not some bridges. Every single bridge. The official plan for crossing rivers was to seal the hull, attach a snorkel to the engine intake, and drive the tank along the river bottom like a 188-ton submarine. The vehicle designed to dominate the battlefield couldn't cross a river without turning into a diving bell. It also consumed fuel at a catastrophic rate, in a war where Germany was already rationing every drop of gasoline. Every mile the Moz drove was fuel that could have powered dozens of lighter, actually combat-effective vehicles. Only 2 prototypes were ever completed. Neither one saw a single minute of actual combat. Soviet forces captured the pieces at the Kummersdorf testing grounds outside Berlin as the war ended. Today, a reconstructed Moz sits in the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow. Germany's ultimate superweapon ended up as a Russian tourist attraction. Germany was running out of everything: fuel, steel, manpower. And their answer was to build a tank that consumed all 3 at record speed. That decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. The Moz was too heavy to fly. But leave it to the Soviet Union to look at a regular tank and say, what if we gave it wings? Number 4. The Antonov A-40 flying tank. The Soviet military in 1942 had a problem. Partisan fighters operating behind German lines in occupied territory needed armored support, but there was no way to drive tanks hundreds of miles through enemy-held forests and roads. Aircraft designer Oleg Antonov, working out of his bureau in Moscow, proposed a solution that sounds like a rejected pitch from a Bond villain. Take a T-60 light tank, bolt a set of biplane glider wings and a tail assembly onto it. Tow the entire thing behind a Tupolev TB-3 bomber and let it glide into a field near the partisans. The concept was called Krylya Tanka, which translates to tank wings. And they actually built one. To make the T-60 light enough to get airborne, the engineers stripped out its weapons, its ammunition, its headlights, and most of its fuel. So the armored vehicle meant to provide firepower on the battlefield arrived at its destination with no guns, no ammo, and barely enough diesel to drive off the landing strip. It was an armored taxi with wings. On September 2, 1942, test pilot Sergei Anokhin climbed inside the modified T-60 at an airfield outside Moscow, and the TB-3 bomber began towing it down the runway. The plane strained under the enormous drag of a tank hanging behind it. The bomber crew fought to gain altitude. Eventually, the TB-3 pilots realized they were about to crash and cut the tow cable early. The Antonov A-40, now a free-flying tank, reportedly glided smoothly down to a field near the airfield. Anokhin dropped the wings and tail, started the engine, and drove the tank back to base, under its own power. So technically the flying tank flew. Once, without weapons, for a very short distance, before nearly killing the bomber crew. No aircraft in the Soviet fleet was powerful enough to tow a tank at the required speed without nearly stalling out of the sky. The project was abandoned immediately. A tank that could fly but not fight, pulled by a plane that nearly crashed doing it. Peak wartime ambition. But flying a tank at least required a bomber and an airfield. The French military went a different direction entirely. They strapped a cannon to a Vespa scooter. Number 3. The Vespa 150 Tab. In 1956, the French military was fighting colonial wars in Algeria and Indochina, and their paratroopers needed a lightweight, portable anti-tank weapon they could drop behind enemy lines. The solution they came up with is either the most creative or the most ridiculous piece of military engineering ever conceived, depending on your perspective. They took a standard Vespa 150 motor scooter, the same kind of scooter you'd see parked outside a cafe in Paris, reinforced the frame, and mounted an American-made M20 75mm recoilless rifle directly onto it. The cannon could fire a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating 100 millimeters of armor. That is enough firepower to destroy a tank. Mounted on a scooter that weighs less than some adult humans, the Vespa 150 taps were parachute dropped in pairs, each accompanied by a two-man crew. One soldier drove. The other handled the weapon. The idea was that they could zip behind enemy lines on the scooter, set up the rifle on a tripod, fire at an armored target, and speed away before the enemy could react. The weapon was not designed to be fired while riding. The intended procedure was to stop the scooter, dismount, set up the cannon on its own tripod, aim carefully, and then fire. Which means the Vespa was really just a very expensive, over-engineered weapons delivery moped, a taxi for a cannon. Between 500 and 800 of these were actually manufactured and deployed with French airborne forces. This was not a prototype sitting in a warehouse. Real paratroopers rode these into real combat zones in North Africa and Southeast Asia. Somewhere in a French military procurement office in the 1950s, someone looked at a Vespa scooter and a 75mm cannon and decided these two things belonged together. And then hundreds of people in the chain of command agreed with them. A cannon on a scooter is absurd, but at least firing the Vespa's weapon wouldn't kill the person pulling the trigger. This next one, it absolutely could. Number 2. The M28 Davy Crockett. The Cold War. NATO military planners are staring at maps of Western Europe and running the same terrifying calculation over and over. If the Soviet Union launched a full-scale invasion through the Fulda Gap corridor into West Germany, thousands of Russian tanks would pour across the border faster than NATO forces could possibly stop them. Some intelligence analysts predicted that a single NATO battalion of 300 to 400 troops could face 120 advancing Soviet tanks within the first 30 minutes. The American military's answer to this problem is one of the most unhinged weapons concepts in the history of warfare. Take a nuclear warhead, make it small enough to carry in a jeep, and fire it from a recoilless rifle operated by a three-man infantry crew. The M28 and M29 Davy Crockett weapon system used the W-54 nuclear warhead, weighing about 51 pounds. It was the smallest nuclear weapon the United States ever deployed. The M28 lightweight version had a maximum range of roughly 1.25 miles. The M29 heavy version could reach about 2.5 miles. Now here's the part that makes this weapon legendary on every list of terrible military ideas. The lethal radiation radius of the W-54 warhead extended to a distance that overlapped significantly with the weapon's own maximum range. The soldiers firing the weapon were potentially inside the kill zone of their own nuclear device. The training manuals included instructions for the crew to seek cover after firing, which is a polite way of saying you just detonated a nuclear bomb close enough to irradiate yourself. Accuracy was another issue. This was a nuclear warhead launched from what amounted to a large recoilless rifle mounted on a tripod. The circular error probable was enormous. You could not aim this weapon with precision. But then again, when your ammunition is an atomic bomb, pinpoint accuracy isn't really the priority. Over 2,100 Davy Crockett systems were manufactured and deployed to U.S. forces in West Germany, Guam, Hawaii, Okinawa, and South Korea. Regular infantry battalions had access to tactical nuclear weapons. 3 enlisted soldiers in a foxhole could theoretically start a nuclear exchange. The weapon was withdrawn from service in 1971, partly because NATO leadership realized that defending Western Europe by showering it with tactical nuclear weapons might leave nothing worth defending. That's not a typo, by the way. They built over 2,000 portable nuclear launchers and gave them to frontline troops before someone pointed out the obvious flaw: a nuclear weapon that can kill its own operators. That's difficult to top. But number 1 on this list isn't here because it was dangerous. It's here because of the sheer, unfiltered audacity of how it was built. Number 1. The Bob Semple tank. France has fallen to the German blitzkrieg. Britain is pulling every available tank back to defend the home islands. Japan is rapidly expanding across the Pacific, conquering territory across Southeast Asia. And New Zealand, sitting in the South Pacific with a small military and almost no heavy equipment, is genuinely afraid of a Japanese invasion. They need tanks. They have exactly 0. Enter Bob Semple. Not a military engineer. Not a weapons designer. The New Zealand Minister of Public Works. A politician. Semple's entire design reference for building a tank was an American postcard, a single postcard that showed a picture of a tractor being converted into an armored vehicle. No engineering specifications, no dimensions, no material requirements, no blueprints of any kind. Just a picture on a piece of cardstock that someone had mailed from the United States. Working from that postcard and nothing else, Semple and his team at the Public Works Department workshops in Temuka took a Caterpillar D8 farm tractor, bolted on a superstructure made of corrugated manganese steel plating, and called it a tank. The corrugated design was chosen because they hoped the ridges would deflect bullets. The vehicle stood roughly 12 feet tall, about the height of a double-decker bus, making it visible from approximately every direction on any battlefield. The Bob Semple tank carried a crew of 8. Its armament was 6 Bren light machine guns positioned around the hull. One of the gunners had to lie flat on a mattress placed directly on top of the engine block to fire his weapon. The engine vibrated so violently that accurate shooting was physically impossible. The crew was deafened by the noise inside the hull, and because the vehicle used a farm tractor's transmission, it had to come to a complete stop every time it changed gears. It weighed between 20 and 25 tons. It was slow. It was loud. It couldn't shoot straight. The corrugated armor would not have stopped anything more substantial than a harsh look. When the Bob Semple tank was demonstrated to the New Zealand public and military, it was met with immediate, universal, and very loud ridicule. Newspapers mocked it openly. Citizens laughed at it. Politicians from Semple's own party criticized the design. Bob Semple's response to the criticism has become legendary in its own right. He essentially fired back and said that he didn't see anyone else coming up with better ideas. Which, honestly, is a fair point when your country has no tanks, no military industry, and a potential invasion force bearing down on you. 3 Bob Semple tanks were built. None of them ever saw combat. The Japanese never invaded New Zealand. The tanks were eventually stripped of their armor and returned to agricultural service as regular tractors. Today, the Bob Semple tank is an internet legend. It has its own meme following, fan art, and a devoted community of people who love it precisely because it represents everything ridiculous about desperate wartime engineering. A politician, a postcard, and a tractor walked into a workshop. And that's not the setup to a joke. That's how New Zealand built a tank. So there they are, 10 military vehicles that never should have left the drawing board. Flying platforms, tricycle tanks, ice aircraft carriers, nuclear bazookas, and a tank built from a postcard. Every one of them was born from a real problem. Trenches needed crossing. Oceans needed patrolling. Soviet tanks needed stopping. Japanese invasions needed deterring. The problems were legitimate. The solutions were catastrophic. War pushes engineering to its absolute limits. Sometimes that pressure produces the jet engine or radar or GPS. And sometimes it produces a cannon strapped to a Vespa scooter. If there's one takeaway from this list, it's that the scariest words in military engineering aren't nuclear warhead. They're, we'll figure it out as we go.